Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today HR Strategies Consulting webinar, Understanding COVID-19's Impact on Employment and Hiring. My name is Peter Santini. I'm the Vice President of HR Management Consulting at HR Strategies. I'm going to be facilitating this session today. And joining me as our guest presenter is James Fahrenbach, Founder and Principal Consultant of Golden Ratio Recruitment. James is a very experienced HR recruiter, talent management guru, who's going to take us through his perceptions today on what's been happening in the recruitment world with the COVID impact. So today's session, today's topic, COVID-19 pandemic, understanding the impact on employment. What sectors are winning and losing? What jobs are lost? How many have really come back? Impact on how and where people work. And then we're going to focus on understanding the impact on hiring. What's working effectively now than it did pre-COVID? What do you need to do differently going forward? What directions are things headed? And what do we need to do to adapt? So we're going to be moving forward with that. And just as we're going along, if you do have any questions, please use the chat process, and we'll be monitoring the chat window if anybody has any questions from that perspective. So let's get into it. I'm just going to turn it over to James and ask James to take us through the presentation. Over to you, James.
All right, thank you, Peter. I'd like to preface this by saying I'm going to tell some stories with pictures, with data, and with words. Pictures, as the cliche says, say 1,000 words. And these two pictures, the top one feels like the headwind we started to push against in March, and the one at the bottom is this week, plus or minus, depending on what part of the country you're in. That headwind is feeling even colder and heavier than it was 6 months ago. Peter, you want to go to the next slide?
Sure.
So we've probably seen too many images like this, but this one kind of captures for me how this year has felt, that we're getting battered from every direction, and it does feel like it's been pretty relentless. Next slide. There you go. I don't think this one needs too much explanation. We're dealing with waves. The one we're dealing with right now certainly feels like that tall one, and I think we all wish that it had an end point like this roller coaster does, that went straight down, but unfortunately we know that's not what we're going to be experiencing. I think we're going to be experiencing something more like the next slide. Peter, if you want to head on to that one. Yeah, that's kind of what it feels like this month. And if you're a recruiter, for the next slide is an image that, you know, for a guy like me who spends, excuse me, a lot of time snorkeling and scuba diving, recruiting before COVID felt like we, you know, herding fish that were relatively well behaved and heading in a similar direction. And if you go to the next slide, Peter, this is what it looks like now, with a chaos in the pool of candidates and that group of fish in the background fading very quickly. The next slide. And this is what it feels like if you're a recruiter, and that's not me. I don't own a spear gun, but certainly, you know, the idea that we're not casting a big net, we need something a little bit more precise, is a theme that I feel is pretty strong right now. And the next slide, I think if you're a candidate, and we all grew up playing the game of musical chairs, it really feels like the game of musical chairs is one that we're all playing, and there's a lot of empty chairs, and the chairs that are remaining are disappearing very fast. Next slide, Peter. And so this, the haves and the have-nots, this slide kind of sums it up to me. It's a picture of Mumbai. And one of the things that COVID is really doing is just increasing the size of the divide between the haves and the have-nots. Next slide, Peter. And so here we'll get into the data and all of the these graphs and the data that I referred to over the course of the presentation, you can find in the articles that are listed at the end of the presentation. This data is so crazy, as the cliche is, you couldn't even make this stuff up. You know, that spike on the far right is how quickly the shares left the game at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. And the next slide.
It's funny you say that, because when I see this, it actually reminds me of when my young daughters were younger, their attempts on drawing was so random.
Yeah, it's like somebody bumped somebody's elbow at
Exactly.
when they were finishing it. And so there's some interesting trends within who's losing jobs. And one of the unfortunate things is that there a lot of people who are out of work or were out of work are going to find it even more difficult to get back into the workforce. The you know, in October alone, the number of long-term unemployed people rose by 150,000. The total long-term unemployed is almost 250,000, and that's almost a quarter of all of the unemployed. So,
which is interesting because we've never had this deal with this in recent times, have we?
No, no. This is very different than any of the other crises that we've gone through, and you can see even the financial crisis referred to in this graph. If you go to the next slide, you'll see one of the other key differences. You know, recessions in the past have typically hit men harder than women. You know, manufacturing jobs have been the ones that were early impacted, but now with it being service, health, and you know, daycare and other things that were impacted, you can see that the drop for women has been more dramatic and the recovery has been slower. Next slide. Again, really putting a finer point on it, you know, who you are, how old you are, and what sector you work in, really having a very significant impact. And you can see how jobs outside of technology dropped more dramatically and have not recovered nearly as well as jobs outside of technology. So I started the next slide with the comment about lag time, and I don't know, maybe it'll catch on, but it's one of the things that I found most disturbing about the stats and trying to figure out where things are and where things are going is whether it's the healthcare related data, the economic and employment related data, we're weeks or months behind. And we inform our behaviors by what we read in the news today, which is something that happened a month or two in the past. I think that's something that all of us need to remind ourselves every time we see a news article that quotes some new statistic. But, you know, how bad was it? You know, 30% of Canadians lost their jobs, and the CERB payments to 9 million Canadians. And I just read an article over the last day or two that said they're having trouble rationalizing the number of people who received CERB versus the number of people who are claiming to be unemployed. You know, it's we'll talk a little bit more about that effect later. And job postings down significantly. The only data that I could find was about Indeed, but I think all of us would clearly say that we've seen job postings for most sectors decline over the last few months, show signs of improvement and then go back into hibernation. All right, I think we can go to the next slide then. So, you know, some interesting things have happened in terms of how COVID has affected everybody versus how it's affected various specific sectors. And one of the things, you know, that I think is the most significant difference about COVID is the effect it's having is the complexity. We've got a healthcare scare, an economic impact, and the compounding effect of having many of us living like one-man bands at home, having to have a house or an apartment that's both a workplace, a school place, a daycare, is making all of them harder. And I know talking to my HR colleagues in other who focus more on things other than recruiting, the effect of that and them being able to keep people whole certainly has been growing. And the death of the open concept office with remote work, this is, I think, a concept that was long overdue to move into history. And I think this is one of the trends with remote work being as prevalent as it is that we're going to see really take a stronger root here. You want to go on to the next slide, Peter? So in terms of the sector specific, I already talked a little bit about the fact that women are being impacted more than men. And I think it's also shown in the stats of how difficult it is to get the employment parity that was starting to be more of a reality between men and women, I think has taken a bit of a setback as a result of this. The impact on frontline service jobs, I could do a whole presentation. We're all living and breathing that every day. What I thought was the most profound and significant impact for white collar, professional, non-service related jobs is the remote work. And there are, the 2 million more people that I referred to in the slide brings the total working at home in Canada to 4.2 million. You want to head to the next slide? Thank you. And one of the other interesting effects that COVID is having is that it's really causing things to head in opposite directions depending on what part of the economy you are working in. You want to go to the next slide, Peter? A lot of people, you've probably heard of the K-shaped recovery. What we're finding is whether it's demographics or economic situation, depending on whether you're on the upper arm of the K or the lower arm of the K, how we're experiencing the pandemic is different. And unfortunately, that the direction and the speed at which those directions are changing is increasing. We've all heard the news about the billionaires getting richer. And as I said in the previous job, people without jobs finding it more and more difficult to get back into the workforce. So, this slide talks a little bit about how significant that impact has been. And when you look at the number of low wage employees in the workforce, down by 750,000 from what it was a year ago. And for those of us with young adults or children about to enter the workforce, when you look at the stats that talk about how difficult it is for youth to hold a job or get a job, I think we all see this as an area that we're going to have to try and find a way to help them. Next slide, Peter. So what's changed? Hiring goes virtual. Who would have guessed a year ago that 100% of interviews would, or virtually 100% of interviews would be happening virtually? The concept of remote work, really a double-edged sword. While for some organizations it means that they can start to recruit from a larger geographical area. What is also happening, and we're seeing fairly significant growth of US firms knocking on the doors of Canadians because they no longer need to try and convince them to come south of the border to work. I touched on the CERB, and my practice includes work at the hourly level, working in manufacturing and customer service jobs. And this is where I would say the effect of CERB has been by far the most dramatic. In the early stages of the pandemic, it was there were almost no candidates applying for hourly wage jobs because it didn't make sense for them to go to work when they could stay home. We're seeing that improve a little bit, but it's still a very significant factor to organizations trying to recruit at that level, that there's a disincentive, and probably a lot of people, according to the recent stats, that probably shouldn't have been getting that money. As a recruiter that lives in LinkedIn a significant portion of my day, one of the trends that I've found really accelerated over the last number of months is the quality of profiles that can be found on LinkedIn is really diminished. I say here, it's starting to feel like Indeed with pictures, and for most recruiters, Indeed would have been seen as a job where people who are a job posting site where people who were desperately looking for work were more likely found. LinkedIn was more the passive candidate pool. I would say LinkedIn is starting to feel very much like a place where people who are desperate for work are posting. And although I can't prove it, my sense is that it feels like a lot of people who are the candidates that we would like to hire are turning off their profiles because they're just being bombarded by recruiters and filling up their inbox. And the mythical passive candidate, a topic that every recruiting related conversation over the last decade seems to have included as the key to success. I think we need to realize that the passive candidate pool has shrunk dramatically. The uncertainty factor that has been introduced by COVID, and I think has anyone with tenure of more than a couple of years in a current job thinking even more seriously about why would they leave at this time and take a risk with a new employer. So I want to head to the next slide. So not surprisingly, early in the pandemic, I talked to a number of partner firms and different recruiting agencies who were laying off recruiters as hiring pretty much came to a halt. Talked to some people internally who were hiring recruiters internally in some of the areas where recruiting was pretty active, and they repeatedly said that the pool of candidates they had to choose from was dramatically bigger than they had experienced in the past. And fast forward 6 or so months to now, the market seems to be that, again, going back to that divergence between the areas where there's the haves and the have-nots, number of offer declines, candidates with multiple offers in technology in particular, dramatically increasing. And the people I talk to in the hourly service and lower level roles talking about the number of opportunities that they are able to get interview for declining. And what does this mean to recruiters and to organizations that are needing to hire recruiters? I think it's changing the dynamic of the internal and external recruiter. The opportunity, as I said, recruiting agencies finding it harder and harder to get new business. The emphasis on using the internal recruiters who may not be as busy and getting them to do work differently. And the hunter-gatherer, farmer, harvester, the days of recruiters being true hunters, I think the game that they can chase is significantly less, and all of us are becoming more focused on the gathering and the farming and the harvesting. So where are we now? And going back to what I said about the fact that there's a lag time behind the stats that we see. The trend that we saw with the unemployment falling from almost 14% to around 9%. I think unfortunately we're going to see that number go back up. I just saw a stat yesterday about the U.S. that had another 750,000 new claims for unemployment in the last week. So I'm afraid that 80% of pre-COVID employment might be as close as we get in 2020, and what 2021 has to offers, I think, a mystery that we're all eager to find out. Uh, and a little bit of an insight into where that might be going. The next couple of slides, Peter, if you want to pop to the next one, looking at job postings, getting a sense of where the demand is growing, and I think, as you'll see over the course of these 3 slides, there's some consistency to that. Some of the spike in demand is simply us getting back to full employment in areas like sales and customer service. Some of it, as you'll see from the fact that the tax specialist shows it prominently both on this slide and on the next slide, as one of the most in demand. That's a factor of timing. I think everybody's tax returns are going to be more complex next year than they were. And this would typically be the time that organizations are trying to get ahead of the curve and make sure they've got enough tax specialists. And then the other one area that's changing is in technology, and you can see references in this slide and the next slide to .NET development, software engineers, graphic designers. All of those really never really missed a beat, and the fact that they're now growing is a reflection of the fact that a lot of organizations, particularly in technology, where there isn't a direct impact of COVID, are hiring aggressively. And the conversation I had with a partner agency over the last week, good example of that. He picked up 3 or 4 new clients, each looking for between 5 and 15 new software developers. Do you want to skip ahead, Peter? I think people can look through these slides and find the sectors that are most relevant to them, and hopefully some of these statistics will help them explain to whoever they need to explain to why they're facing some of the challenges that they're facing. And then the next slide, how do we face those challenges? And one of the paradigms that I've always felt is critical to being successful in recruiting is recognizing where you are in the marketplace. And in this case, are you in a sector that's directly impacted and still needing to recruit? And what does that mean versus one of the areas where the war for talent has just gotten worse and not, this is really nothing new. Hiring the best available talent is a concept I came up with a number of years ago. And some people, told me to some people it feels like giving in or capitulating. But the truth is that smart organizations recognize that they have to be real about what's available, whether it's in their sector, in their geography, or based on where they fit in the hierarchy compared to the competitive landscape. And as I was talking to Peter the other day, we're bringing in a lot of really, really good new immigrants. And I've been able to help a number of them over the last 6 months in the middle of the pandemic get their first job here in Canada, despite what's been going on. And I encourage everybody to spend the time to recognize those people, many of whom started the process of coming over here well before COVID, stuck to their plans. And I think we all would love to see them working as quickly as possible. And the fact that organizations have had to downsize, I mean, normally the sense is that when people downsize, it's not the top performers. This situation is different because of some of the significant wholesale reductions that had to happen. So I think all of us need to take a fresh eye towards immigrants and people who are without a job and not hold them quite as responsible. And in terms of what you do with your recruiters, hire smarter recruiters. The trend I saw when recruiting was the hot commodity, people were hiring less and less experienced recruiters, thinking that the technology could do the work for them. And the reality is that the harder recruiting is, the more value a smart and experienced recruiter who understands the difference between sourcing and full stack and is going to be able to help you out. And as an organization, based on where you fit in the marketplace, understanding where your time, energy, and money should be spent. Does it make sense to spend more money on marketing when the candidates you want aren't aren't available, versus spending more money on selection and getting better at identifying the right people. And that really ties into the next point around investing in ATS and assessments. I assume almost every organization that's doing any kind of volume of recruiting has an ATS. In my experience working with dozens of different organizations over the last couple of years, very few of them take full advantage of what the functionality can offer them in terms of making their work more effective by using pre-screening questions, and really leveraging the networking capability that they have. And assessments, this is not a pitch for a sales pitch for Predictive Index. A lot of these presentations I know end up being a pitch for a product, but I'm going to give just a minor one here. The Predictive Index is a tool that I've used for a decade. Inexpensive, very simple for candidates to use, and extremely reliable at identifying the hidden gems, the diamonds in the rough. And I think all of us need to do a better job of that if we're going to be able to find the people who can solve our problems, even if they don't fit the job we need to fill exactly. And the last thing, all of us, I think, are guilty at some point or another as organizations, as recruiters, at chasing the purple squirrels. Hopefully this is a bit of a reality check. The purple squirrels are even harder to find, and we got to stop chasing them and hire smarter, hire the best available talent, and make the best of what we can find. I think that's all I've got, Peter.
Sorry about that. Not sure what happened. You there? Hello?
I'm here.
Oh. Not sure what. Go back to the slideshow. Current slide. There it goes. So that's where we were left off, right?
Yeah, I think we got through that.
So listen, from that perspective, of a matter in the chat, there are no questions at the moment, but hopefully we'll have a couple questions to go forward. One thing that I thought was interesting, and maybe we should have a conversation to see if there's any other questions, is we talked about the passive candidates, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that will change as COVID dissipates, that the more people who have decided to stay out of the job searching realm get more active if COVID starts to go away?
I think that is likely to be the case, but I don't see that changing dramatically in the near term. I would say it's 3 to 6 months before the level of uncertainty will diminish enough for people to actually say, okay, I can see the future. None of us can see the future.
We're starting to see the dust settle a little bit, and I'm starting to feel more comfortable that things aren't going to change, or there's not going to be a fourth wave or a third wave. Or
that's exactly what I was thinking, is that until people are confident that there isn't going to be another significant wave, I don't think the passive candidate pool is going to change much.
And from your dealings with your clients and potential candidates, the concept of now people are looking for people and they can work from anywhere. And that's an attractive element to a lot of people. But again, do you think that still has a lot of uncertainty with people? They may say, yeah, you're saying that I can work if the company's in Vancouver and I'm in Saskatchewan, I'm working from Saskatchewan. Do you think when all this settles that they're going to want me to move to British Columbia? Do you get any sense of that?
I do there, and you're right. There is sort of a subset of conversations going on about, is it remote forever?
Yeah.
And the reality is that while there's a lot of talk about organizations going to remote forever, I would say the number that are going to go fully remote forever will probably be relatively small. And I've had a number of companies say, please don't recruit someone who will not be able to come to the office
Eventually.
Yeah. So how that all shakes out, that's where I think 2021 is going to be really telling in terms of how pervasive the long-term fully or primarily remote trend is going to remain.
Makes sense. So we do have a question. It says, I know not the focus of the presentation, but you talked about moving away from marketing and focusing on screening. Can you provide any suggestions, info on screening tools, options to consider?
Uh, so as I said, in terms of ATS, I think it depends on the recommendations on the size of your organization. If you're small to medium sized organizations, products like Jazz HR, Smart Recruiters are ones that I've used, and then they're pretty effective. Um, if you're a larger organization, I mean, something like, iSIMS uh, uh, is one of the best that I remember. It's actually been a while since I've used one of the enterprise tools. I don't know, Peter, if you're familiar with any, other ones, but those would be the
Yeah,
ones that.
like on the larger size, the Success Factors has an ATS system or recruitment
Right.
and onboarding component for, medium to large organizations that allows the whole gamut of connecting with people through the initial recruitment process, and then effectively shifting that to get them to be on the onboarding component as well. So
So
there's a number of tools out there, but those are I'd say the ones you mentioned, and if you throw Success Factors in there, it covers a lot of the bases.
the good news is that the power of those tools, even at a relatively low cost, is so dramatically better than it was 5 or 10 years ago. Um, so the other thing, and, just to talk about the value of the assessment tools, and I think they're equally or more valuable than the ATS right now. Um, the ones I use, as I mentioned, Predictive Index. Uh, their personality assessment takes 7 or 8 minutes. They have a cognitive assessment that takes 12 minutes. And from an efficiency point of view, this drives my practice because I don't have time to spend on people who don't have the horsepower or the fit. And I interview a small fraction of people, a much smaller fraction of people than I would without these tools, because for the most part, I have people use one or both of these, go through one or both of these before I agree to interview them.
Actually,
And
someone just asked the question, can you explain what the predictive learning index is? So
predictive learning index is basically, they don't like to call it this, but it's a 12-minute IQ test. It's language independent. It's available in 80 different languages, so that it reduces that bias. It's a combination of word, math, and pattern recognition questions. The design based on the time limit, the number of questions, the variation of complexity, um, extremely reliable. Uh, and it's not about, smart. All too much is not always better. If you're talking, I use it for frontline assembly workers, in fact, almost to make sure that they're not too smart, because if you want someone to do the same job every day, you don't want someone with, who should be a rocket scientist.
true. Now, I guess the question in terms of assessment tools, there's different types of assessment tools that you can use for, the screening process, and then the matching process, and then more in depthly in terms of, the full matching process, when you're talking about very complicated type of roles that are more management like and so forth. So screening tools are and assessment tools, there's a big gamut of them depending on what you want to use them for. Um, so that's the challenge with what's the right assessment tool to use depending on the roles and the level of the organization. But again, it's just another added component to your whole recruitment process and talent selection process, whatever works best for your organization, and to assess the skill levels of the people that you need to do those jobs. And that's the key, is to make sure whatever assessment tool you in is actually giving you good data to make a selection on whether or not someone either has a skill, ability, capability, or the cultural fit to your organization. Would you agree?
Absolutely. The validation, and one of the reasons I like using the predictive index, it's actually one of the oldest tools of its kind. It was the father, so to speak, of Myers-Briggs and DISC. It's been validated hundreds of times across all different kinds of roles. And there are tools within it that allow you to validate it against your own version of a particular role to identify what are the characteristics from a personality point of view that would be required, and to a lesser extent, what is the cognitive skill that would be required for someone for that kind of job.
Exactly. I mean, at the end of the day, if you what you build into your screening process and selection process, it's got to be validated, and it's got to be consistently used. And the information, if you decide to discard it, then it's not worth doing, right? And also the time and effort, and also with today's technology, there's a lot of online assessment processes that you can have candidates log into and complete stuff relatively quickly, and on a per candidate basis is relatively cheap too. So
Agreed.
again, but
As
it
I say,
also,
the two that I use combined take candidates a total of 20 minutes. I would say I have less than 5% of the candidates resist or decline participation. So it's, that's the thing. You don't want people to drop out of your process because
right,
your process is too complicated. And that's why where you put them in the process sometimes is a strategic decision, depending on whether someone's been recruited. For example, I headhunted a very senior person yesterday who I decided didn't need to do these assessments because of that circumstance, versus someone who applies and is,
right.
that person, and particularly, like, interestingly enough, a bit of a cultural difference. New immigrants almost never resist. They're much more exposed. They're used to this kind of process, much more
Much
so.
more in-depth analysis from that
Much
perspective.
more
So
than human.
listen, if I were to ask you to take your crystal ball out and say, from a recruitment selection perspective, where we're going to be 8-10 months from now, what would you say?
Uh, that's a good question. It's going to be it's going to be worse, not better, for most of us, right? The haves and the have-nots. I foresee continuing job losses in the sectors which are already struggling, and I see continuing frustration and escalation of the war for talent in the technology sector.
Cool. I kind of think I kind of agree with you from that perspective. So listen, I think I don't see any other questions at the moment. So why don't we take it from here and say, thank you for participating. And James, thanks for your information and your presentation. Greatly appreciate your time and effort. And I'd like to thank everyone who participated, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Good luck
Thanks,
hunting.
everyone. Good luck hunting and finding the right people for your organizations. Have a nice day.